Do you feel politically homeless?
Join the club.
Both parties are becoming more tribal, and neither fully represent the values of Jesus. Christians need a path forward that leaves partisanship behind.
That's why we wrote Truth Over Tribe, pledging allegiance to the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant. Together, we can end tribalism.
Pre-order the book on Amazon, and let's start a movement.
Can you talk about how they portrayed Hitler, and maybe even specifically around the 1936 Olympics?
Yeah, the Times was very, they really handled Hitler with kid gloves, especially as Hitler was starting to rise to prominence in the late 1920s. And the one quote that I really love was that they write that Hitler was not a threat, and that he was, quote unquote, actuated by a lofty, unselfish patriotism. And again, reassuring readers that he has no chance of rising to power in Germany because of Germany's constitution, et cetera. And you just think, whoa, okay, you got that one wrong, but I guess, people make mistakes. But then you fast forward to the mid 1930s. And we're talking about a time where the Nazis were heavily pushing propaganda. They were starting to organize pogroms, these mass hate crimes against Jews of Germany, and they staged the Olympics of 1936 as this mass Nazi propaganda effort to legitimize the regime in front of the eyes of the world, and in particular to America, because that America was the big X factor for Hitler. Hitler understood he could take on Britain alone, and he could probably conquer Europe, and he might even be able to deal with the Russians if they were ever to get into the war. But America was the great democratic behemoth that he didn't want to wake that sleeping giant. So if he was able to start to convince the American elite and the American public, of course, that the Germans were, Germany under the Nazis they were okay, and it was all just, misunderstanding. And that's what the Nazi Olympics were all about. And when the New York Times ran their huge article after the Olympics, their reporter had this banner headline saying, the Berlin Olympics are the greatest sporting events of all time. And this article goes on to praise Berlin's clean streets and the beauty of the city, and how hospitable the Germans were, and never mentions that in these flag-lined streets of Berlin, all those flags were swastikas. Never mentions once in this many thousand-word article that the people who were left out of those games were Jews, because they were being rounded up and they were being subjected to the Nuremberg laws, which were laws to restrict Jews' ability to work, to intermarry, to date other people, to date non-Jews. I mean, this was a full-blown racist society, not in the way we talk about racism today, which is something that is maybe a bit under the surface or is built into structures or whatever. This was out in the open racism and hatred. And that is what they legitimized the New York Times with this kind of reporting.
So I can imagine someone hearing this, and this is what they might think. They might think two things. Well, number one, lots of people got the Nazis wrong. Neville Chamberlain got the Nazis wrong. So it's easy in retrospect to damn the New York Times for getting Hitler wrong. And the second question might be, well, is that just what everybody else reported? Is there just kind of anti-Semitic reporting across the U.S.? They were just one, part of a kind, and that was the era. So what would you say to those questions?
I looked at that kind of comparative sourcing, comparative reporting, to see what other people were actually saying at the same time, particularly about the Nazi games. And first of all, there was a really big push in the United States to boycott the games. And that was backed by a lot of American newspapers. And when that failed, these newspapers, including reporters like William Shirer, who I mentioned before, bemoaned the games as a Nazi spectacle, a Nazi propaganda spectacle. The Washington Post did as well. They considered it to be a complete sham, and they considered the success of the games in the eyes of the world community to be a major win for Nazism and a defeat of democratic values. So you can actually go back and look at the reporting and see it was quite unique to the New York Times.
So you earlier said the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Disinformation being wrong information with intent. I'm trying on some level to deceive you or to persuade you to believe something different. So again, it begs the question, well, what was the New York Times goal? I mean, why in the world would the New York Times be interesting in propping up and supporting Nazism in Germany?
The New York Times bureau, Berlin bureau at that a man named Guido Endaris, who was widely acknowledged by his colleagues, not by anybody else, by his colleagues, to be a Nazi sympathizer. In my book, he was actually a Nazi collaborator. His reporting was so favorable to the Nazis that the German officials would read his reports aloud on Nazi radio broadcasts without editing them. They would just read them because they made the Germans sound really great. And the New York Times knew this. The management was made aware of this, and including by a sort of mid-level editor at the Times in New York, who was a Jewish man, who said, we cannot allow a Nazi sympathizer to run the most important bureau in all of Europe today. And the New York Times management threatened him with a libel lawsuit. They said, if you come forward, you're going to get slapped with a lawsuit. And they did that because this guy, Guido Endaris, this guy who was running their bureau in Berlin, had great access. He had the best sources in among the Nazi brass. And that's because they loved him. They would come to him with good stories. He would get the goods. He would keep them. He'd keep the paper in the #1 spot. He was generating scoop after scoop after scoop. And that's what a newspaper loves. The problem is that when you get so wrapped up with being #1, when staying on top, that you lose sight of all other values, that, you know, whether you're a newspaper or any other kind of business, that is the path to perdition. And, you know, that's exactly where that led the New York Times.
Yeah. And again, it's hard, I think, in retrospect, as we look back on it, to imagine that the New York Times could be in any sense a Nazi sympathetic organization. And what I'm hearing you say is actually a little bit complex. Saying, well, the person running the bureau that was sending all the news to the New York Times was a Nazi sympathizer. And you know what? The editorial board, they were very aware of this, and they were willing to compromise because they were getting the best news. What the Nazis were getting out of the deal was a pacified America that wouldn't come to Europe's aid really for another few years after they began their invasion. And so it's really tragic when you think about it from that angle. How does World War II change, or how does World War II maybe not happen if Hitler thinks the Americans are going to attack back? And I think that's a really valid, valuable question.